The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Staff Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his dress uniform one final time. The crisp November air bit at his face, but he barely noticed. After 3 tours in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq, a little London cold was nothing. What made his hands tremble slightly wasn't the weather. It was the weight of the moment. Marcus had been selected from thousands of American Marines to represent the United States at the annual Remembrance Day ceremony. It was an honor that still felt surreal. Just 18 months ago, he had been crouched behind a concrete barrier in Helmand Province, calling in air support while Taliban fighters closed in on his position. Now he stood in the heart of London, preparing to lay a wreath at the cenotaph, alongside representatives from every branch of the British military. The invitation had come through official channels, but Marcus knew the real reason he was here. During his last deployment, his unit had worked closely with British forces in a joint operation that had gone sideways fast. When their convoy was ambushed, Marcus had made a split-second decision that saved the lives of 12 British soldiers, including a young corporal who had been pinned down under heavy fire. The story had made its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching someone important enough to make phone calls across the Atlantic. As Marcus walked through the palace gates, he couldn't help but think about his grandfather, who had stormed the beaches of Normandy 80 years earlier. The old man had always talked about the bond between American and British forces, how they had fought side by side against impossible odds. Now, Marcus was living that connection in a different way, representing that same alliance in peacetime. The security checkpoint was thorough but respectful. British military police examined his credentials with professional courtesy, their own uniforms immaculate despite the early hour. Marcus noticed how they carried themselves, the same quiet confidence he recognized in seasoned combat veterans. These weren't ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up. These were professionals who had earned their positions through blood, sweat, and sacrifice. Inside the palace grounds, Marcus was escorted by a young British officer who seemed genuinely excited to meet him. Lieutenant Davies chatted easily about the day's proceedings, pointing out historical landmarks and sharing stories about previous ceremonies. But Marcus found his attention wandering to the guards he saw stationed throughout the complex. They moved with a precision that spoke of endless hours of training, their red tunics and tall black hats creating an almost surreal contrast against the ancient stone walls. But it was their eyes that caught Marcus's attention. Beneath the pageantry and tradition, he saw something he recognized immediately: the alertness of men who had seen real combat, who understood that their ceremonial duties were backed by very real skills and experience. The briefing room was filled with representatives from a dozen different nations, each wearing their dress uniforms with obvious pride. Marcus found himself seated next to a group of British guardsmen who were discussing the morning's schedule in low, clipped tones. Their conversation was professional, focused entirely on the logistics of the ceremony, but Marcus caught fragments that revealed their backgrounds. One mentioned a recent deployment to Mali. Another referenced training exercises in Estonia. These weren't palace decorations. They were active duty soldiers with recent combat experience. As the briefing began, Marcus learned that he would be paired with a member of the Queen's Guard for the wreath-laying portion of the ceremony. His partner would be Guardsman First Class William Sterling of the Coldstream Guards, a man whose service record, Marcus was told with obvious respect, included multiple deployments to Afghanistan and a commendation for valor under fire. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Here he was, thousands of miles from home, about to stand shoulder to shoulder with a man who had probably faced the same enemies, dealt with the same challenges, and carried the same weight that Marcus knew all too well. The differences in their uniforms, their accents, and their traditions suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what they shared. When the briefing ended, Marcus was led to a smaller room where he would meet Guardsman Sterling. The space was elegant but functional, with portraits of military leaders from centuries past lining the walls. Marcus found himself studying a painting of soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars, marveling at how the uniforms had changed, but the expressions remained the same. Young men carrying responsibilities far beyond their years. The door opened, and Marcus turned to see a man roughly his own age entering the room. Guardsman Sterling was tall and lean, with the kind of bearing that came from years of military discipline. His red tunic was spotless, every button polished to mirror brightness, but it was his face that commanded attention. There was a scar along his left temple, barely visible but unmistakably the mark of combat. His eyes held the same 1,000-yard stare that Marcus had seen in mirrors after particularly difficult missions. For a moment, neither man spoke. They simply stood there, two warriors from different nations, each taking the measure of the other. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet recognition that passed between men who had been tested in ways that most people would never understand. Marcus noticed the small details that others might miss. The way Sterling held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, suggesting an old injury that still bothered him. The unconscious way his eyes swept the room, checking corners and exits out of habit. The controlled breathing of someone who had learned to manage stress and fear through sheer force of will. Sterling, for his part, was conducting his own assessment. He saw the tension in Marcus's jaw, the way the American's hands remained loose and ready despite the formal setting. There was something in Marcus's posture that spoke of recent combat experience, an alertness that hadn't had time to fade into peacetime routine. The silence was finally broken by a palace aide who bustled into the room with a clipboard and an apologetic expression. The ceremony would begin in 30 minutes, she announced, and the two men needed to review their positions and timing one final time. But as she spoke, neither Marcus nor Sterling looked away from each other. Something was building in that moment of recognition. Two men who had served their countries with distinction, who had faced dangers that most civilians couldn't imagine, were about to represent not just their respective nations, but the broader brotherhood of those who had answered the call to serve. The weight of that responsibility, combined with their personal histories, created an atmosphere thick with unspoken understanding. As the aide finished her instructions and hurried away, Marcus and Sterling remained facing each other. The formal ceremony was about to begin, but something deeper was taking place in this quiet room. Two soldiers, separated by nationality, but united by experience, were about to discover just how much they had in common, and how much their meeting would mean to both of them. The tension in the room wasn't hostile. It was the kind of intensity that came from mutual respect, from recognizing a kindred spirit across the divide of nationality and tradition. Neither man knew it yet, but this moment would change both of their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. Outside, the sounds of preparation grew louder as the ceremony approached. But inside this small room, time seemed suspended as two warriors prepared to honor their shared commitment to service, duty, and the bonds that transcend borders. The aide's departure left Marcus and Sterling alone with their unspoken recognition still hanging in the air between them. Sterling was the first to move, extending his hand in the universal gesture of military brotherhood. When Marcus grasped it, the handshake was firm and brief, but both men felt the calluses that told stories of weapons handled under stress, of ropes climbed in training, of equipment maintained under impossible conditions. "Afghanistan?" Sterling asked simply, his accent crisp but not condescending. "3 tours," Marcus replied, studying Sterling's face. "You?" "2, Helmand and Kandahar." Sterling's response was matter of fact, but Marcus caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested those deployments had left their mark. The conversation that followed was unlike anything either man had expected. What started as professional courtesy quickly evolved into something deeper as they discovered an uncanny series of parallels in their service. Marcus had been in Helmand during the summer of 2019, working joint operations with British forces. Sterling had been there at the same time, part of a reconnaissance unit that had provided intelligence support for exactly the kind of missions Marcus had been running. They began comparing notes, dropping unit designations and operation names with the casual precision of men who had lived through history rather than read about it. As they talked, it became clear that their paths had crossed multiple times without either realizing it. The intelligence reports Sterling had filed had directly influenced missions Marcus had executed. The Taliban positions Marcus had helped neutralize had been ones Sterling's unit had been tracking for weeks. Operation Herrick 20, Sterling said suddenly, his voice dropping slightly. Were you part of the convoy support near Gereshk in September? Marcus felt his breath catch. Second convoy. We were the quick reaction force when the first one got hit. He paused, studying Sterling's expression. You were the eyes in the sky that day, weren't you? The voice on the radio that called out the secondary IED position? Sterling nodded slowly. The memory was clearly still vivid for both men. That day had been one of the worst of the deployment, a carefully planned Taliban ambush that had nearly destroyed an entire convoy of British vehicles. Marcus remembered the desperate radio calls. The confusion as multiple roadside bombs went off simultaneously, and then the calm, professional voice that had guided them through the chaos. You saved a lot of lives that day, Marcus said quietly. As did you, Sterling replied. I watched through the scope as you led the counterattack. Textbook small unit tactics under pressure. The weight of that shared experience seemed to fill the room. Both men had been part of something larger than themselves that day, contributing their skills to save lives and complete the mission. But they had never known that the other was there, had never had faces to attach to the voices on the radio or the figures moving across distant terrain. As they continued talking, other connections emerged. Sterling's younger brother had been killed by an IED just 3 months before Marcus's unit arrived in Helmand. Marcus had lost his best friend to a sniper attack in the same general area where Sterling had been conducting patrols. They had both known the weight of writing letters home to families of fallen comrades, had both struggled with the guilt that came from surviving when others didn't. But it wasn't just the shared trauma that bonded them. They discovered a mutual respect for professionalism under pressure, for the kind of split-second decision-making that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Sterling described a night raid where everything had gone wrong, where only the training and instincts of individual soldiers had prevented a massacre. Marcus nodded, understanding completely, and shared his own story of a patrol that had walked into an ambush and fought their way out through pure determination and teamwork. The conversation revealed something else. Both men were struggling with the transition back to peacetime service. Sterling admitted that standing guard at the palace sometimes felt surreal after months of active combat. The pageantry and ceremony were important, he knew, but part of him missed the clarity and purpose that came with active operations. Marcus understood that feeling intimately. Representing his country at formal events was an honor, but it couldn't compare to the sense of purpose he had felt leading Marines in combat. "Do you ever wonder what we're supposed to do with it all?" Sterling asked suddenly. "The things we've seen, the decisions we've made. How do we carry that forward?" Marcus had been asking himself the same question for months. "I think about it every day," he admitted. "Back home, people thank me for my service, but they have no idea what that really means. They see the uniform and think they understand, but they weren't there," Sterling finished. "They didn't have to make those choices." The conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. Another aide appeared, this one more senior, with the bearing of someone accustomed to managing high-profile events. The ceremony was beginning in 15 minutes, she announced, and both men needed to take their positions immediately. As they prepared to leave the room, Marcus felt a strange reluctance to end this conversation. In just 30 minutes, he had connected with Sterling in a way that he hadn't experienced with anyone since returning from his last deployment. Here was someone who truly understood not just the technical aspects of military service, but the emotional weight that came with it. Sterling seemed to feel the same way. As they walked through the palace corridors toward their assigned positions, he spoke quietly about the isolation that came with combat experience. Most of his friends and family back home meant well, but they couldn't relate to the experiences that had shaped him. Even other soldiers who hadn't seen combat looked at veterans like Sterling and Marcus with a mixture of respect and incomprehension. The corridor they walked through was lined with portraits of British military leaders from previous centuries. Sterling pointed to one in particular, a general from the First World War who had led British and American forces in a joint operation. Different wars, same challenges, he observed. Men trying to do right by their soldiers and their mission, dealing with impossible decisions and living with the consequences. Marcus studied the portrait and saw something familiar in the painted eyes. The same distant look he had seen in mirrors after difficult operations. Some things never change, he agreed. As they approached the ceremonial staging area, the sounds of preparation grew louder. Military bands were tuning instruments, officers were checking final details, and representatives from various nations were taking their positions. The pageantry was impressive, but Marcus found himself thinking about the conversation he had just had with Sterling. They were about to participate in a ceremony that honored the sacrifices of millions of soldiers throughout history. But for Marcus, the most meaningful part of the day had already happened in that quiet room where two veterans had recognized each other across the boundaries of nationality and tradition. Sterling seemed to be having similar thoughts. As they reached their assigned position, he turned to Marcus with an expression that was both professional and personal. "Whatever happens out there today," he said quietly, "I want you to know that it's been an honor to meet you. Not just as representatives of our countries, but as soldiers who understand what service really means." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of that recognition. They were about to step into a formal ceremony watched by millions around the world, but the connection they had made transcended all the official protocol and diplomatic nicety. The final preparations were complete. The ceremony was about to begin. Two warriors, who had found unexpected kinship, were preparing to honor their shared commitment to service, carrying with them the knowledge that some bonds transcend borders, uniforms, and even the vast differences in their nation's traditions. As they took their positions, both men carried themselves with the quiet dignity that came from having been tested under fire and proven worthy. The formal ceremony would last only an hour, but the connection they had forged would endure long after the last note of the final hymn faded into the London air. The cenotaph stood before them like a silent sentinel, its simple stone form carrying the weight of countless sacrifices. As Marcus and Sterling approached their designated position, the gravity of the moment settled over both men like a familiar cloak. The crowds lining Whitehall were respectfully quiet, but Marcus could feel the intensity of thousands of eyes watching every step, every gesture. The ceremony began with the haunting notes of a single bugle calling the assembly to attention. Marcus had participated in military ceremonies before, but this felt different. Perhaps it was the presence of Sterling beside him, or maybe it was the knowledge that they were representing not just their individual nations, but the broader alliance that had been forged through shared sacrifice and mutual respect. As they stood at attention, Marcus found his mind drifting to the faces of the men he had served with, those who had made it home and those who hadn't. Standing here in the heart of London, participating in a ritual that honored the fallen, felt like completing a circle that had begun in the dusty hills of Afghanistan. Every name carved into memorial walls, every flag-draped coffin, every letter written to grieving families had led to this moment of formal recognition and remembrance. Sterling's presence beside him added another layer of meaning to the experience. Here was a man who had faced the same challenges, carried the same responsibilities, and borne the same weight of command under fire. The differences in their uniforms seemed insignificant compared to their shared understanding of what it meant to serve. The first wreath was laid by senior British officials, their movements precise and reverent. Marcus watched the ceremony unfold with professional interest, noting the attention to detail and the obvious respect with which every participant approached their role. This wasn't mere pageantry. It was a living connection to the sacrifices that had preserved the freedoms both nations enjoyed. When their turn came, Marcus and Sterling stepped forward together. The wreath they carried was simple but elegant, adorned with the flags of both nations and a small plaque acknowledging the partnership between American and British forces. As they approached the base of the cenotaph, Marcus felt the weight of history pressing down on him. The moment of silence that followed was profound. In those 2 minutes, Marcus found himself thinking not just about the war dead, but about the living veterans who continued to carry the invisible wounds of service. Men like Sterling, who wore their dress uniforms with pride but carried scars that would never fully heal. Women who had served with distinction and returned home to civilian lives that sometimes felt hollow after the intense purpose of military service. During the silence, Marcus became acutely aware of Sterling's presence beside him. Both men stood perfectly still, their training evident in every line of their posture, but there was something more than military discipline at work. There was a shared recognition of what this moment represented. Not just for their countries, but for everyone who had ever put duty before personal safety. When the silence ended and they stepped back from the cenotaph, Marcus caught Sterling's eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, he saw his own emotions reflected: pride, grief, determination, and something that might have been hope. They had honored their fallen comrades in the most formal way possible, but they had also honored each other and the bond they had discovered. The rest of the ceremony proceeded with military precision, but Marcus found himself observing it through new eyes. The representatives from various nations weren't just diplomats or ceremonial figures. They were men and women who had answered their country's calls to service. The differences in their uniforms, their traditions, and their accents couldn't mask the fundamental similarity of their commitment. As the formal proceedings concluded, Marcus and Sterling were directed to a reception area where participants could meet informally before departing. The atmosphere was more relaxed, but the conversations remained respectful and focused on the significance of the day's events. Marcus found himself in conversation with a group of veterans from several different conflicts, each sharing perspectives on military service and the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life. Sterling joined the group naturally, contributing his own experiences with the kind of understated professionalism that Marcus had come to associate with British military culture. What emerged from their conversation was a recognition that the challenges facing modern veterans were remarkably consistent across national boundaries. The sense of purpose that came with military service, the bonds forged under pressure, the difficulty of explaining those experiences to people who hadn't shared them. These were universal experiences that transcended nationality. A Canadian veteran mentioned the difficulty of finding meaningful work after leaving the military. A French officer talked about the challenge of maintaining the sense of brotherhood that had sustained him during deployment. An Australian soldier described the isolation that came with being one of the few people in his hometown who had seen combat. Sterling and Marcus exchanged glances as each story was told. They were hearing their own experiences reflected in the words of men from completely different backgrounds and military traditions. The specifics varied, but the emotional core remained the same. "It's strange," Sterling observed during a quiet moment in the conversation. "We spend so much time focused on the differences between our military cultures, but the essential experience of service seems to be remarkably similar." A retired British colonel who had been listening to their conversation approached with interest. He had served for 30 years, he told them, including tours in the Falklands, Northern Ireland, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In his experience, the best military partnerships had always been built on personal connections between individual soldiers, rather than formal diplomatic agreements. "What you two have discovered today," he said, looking between Marcus and Sterling, "is the foundation of everything that matters in military cooperation. When soldiers from different nations recognize each other as professionals and brothers in arms, that's when real alliances are forged." The colonel's words carried particular weight because of his obvious experience and the respect with which the other veterans treated him. But more than that, his observations seemed to capture exactly what Marcus had been feeling throughout the day. The formal ceremony had been important, but the personal connection with Sterling felt like something that would endure long after the official proceedings were forgotten. As the reception began to wind down, Marcus realized that his time in London was almost over. His flight back to the United States was scheduled for the following morning, and after that, he would return to his regular duties at Camp Lejeune. The thought of leaving felt strange. Not because he had grown attached to London, but because he was reluctant to end this unexpected connection with Sterling. Sterling seemed to be having similar thoughts. As other participants began making their farewells and departing, he approached Marcus with an expression that mixed professional courtesy with genuine personal interest. "I know this might be unusual," Sterling said, "but I was wondering if you might have time for dinner this evening. There's a pub near my flat where military personnel from various countries often gather. Nothing formal, just an opportunity to continue our conversation." Marcus felt a genuine smile cross his face for the first time that day. "I'd like that very much," he replied. "After everything we've shared today, it feels like our conversation has just begun." The formal ceremony was over, but something more important was just beginning. Two soldiers who had found unexpected kinship in the shadow of a war memorial were about to discover that their connection extended beyond their shared military experience into something that might truly be called friendship. As they prepared to leave the official reception, both men carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something meaningful, not just the formal ceremony honoring the war dead, but the creation of a bond that proved military brotherhood could transcend any boundary. The pub Sterling had mentioned was nothing like the formal elegance of Buckingham Palace. The Grenadier was tucked away in a quiet corner of Belgravia, its weathered exterior and small windows giving it the appearance of having stood unchanged for centuries. When Marcus stepped inside, he was immediately struck by the atmosphere, dimly lit, filled with the comfortable buzz of conversation, and decorated with military memorabilia that spanned generations of British service. Sterling had arrived first and secured a corner table away from the main crowd. He had changed from his ceremonial uniform into civilian clothes, but his military bearing remained unmistakable. As Marcus approached, Sterling stood with the automatic courtesy that had been drilled into both men through years of service. The evening began with casual conversation over pints of bitter, but it quickly evolved into something more substantial. Away from the formal constraints of the ceremony, both men found themselves sharing stories and perspectives with surprising openness. Marcus talked about growing up in a small town in North Carolina, where military service was a family tradition stretching back 4 generations. Sterling described his childhood in Yorkshire, where his father's stories of service in the Royal Marines had inspired his own decision to join the Guards. As the evening progressed, their conversation moved beyond personal history to deeper questions about the nature of military service and its place in their lives. Both men had struggled with the transition from active combat roles to more ceremonial duties. Sterling admitted that he sometimes questioned whether standing guard at palaces and participating in state occasions was a worthy use of his training and experience. "Don't misunderstand," he said, taking a thoughtful sip of his beer. "I understand the importance of tradition and ceremony, but after Helmand, after seeing what real threats look like and making life-and-death decisions under pressure, sometimes the ceremonial aspects feel empty," Marcus suggested. "Not empty exactly. More like incomplete." Sterling paused, searching for the right words. "It's meaningful, but it's not the same kind of meaning that comes from protecting your mates under fire or completing a mission that saves lives." Marcus understood completely. His own assignments since returning from Afghanistan had been important, but lacked the immediacy and clear purpose of combat operations. Training recruits was rewarding work, and representing his country at formal events was an honor, but neither provided the same sense of critical importance that had defined his deployment experience. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of several other patrons who clearly recognized Sterling. A group of off-duty British soldiers approached their table with obvious respect, greeting Sterling by name and expressing appreciation for his service at the day's ceremony. When Sterling introduced Marcus as his American counterpart, the group's welcome was immediate and genuine. What followed was an impromptu gathering that grew throughout the evening. Word seemed to spread through some invisible military network, and soon their corner of the pub was filled with servicemen and veterans from multiple conflicts and several different nations. There was a Royal Navy petty officer who had served on destroyers in the Persian Gulf, a Royal Air Force squadron leader who had flown missions over Libya, and even a retired Gurkha who regaled the group with stories from his decades of service. Marcus found himself at the center of conversations about everything from tactical innovations to the challenges of modern counterinsurgency operations. But what struck him most was the easy camaraderie that developed despite the differences in nationality, branch of service, and operational experience. These men shared a common language that transcended their diverse backgrounds. The most poignant moment of the evening came when an older veteran, clearly deep in his cups, began talking about friends lost in the Falklands conflict decades earlier. His words were slurred, but his emotion was clear as he described the weight of surviving when others hadn't. The table fell silent as he spoke, and Marcus saw his own struggles reflected in the faces around him. Sterling placed a hand on the older man's shoulder with quiet compassion. "They're still with us," he said simply. "In what we do, in how we serve, in moments like this when we remember them properly." The veteran nodded, tears visible in his eyes, and the conversation gradually resumed with a deeper sense of shared understanding. Marcus realized that he was witnessing something profound, not just military camaraderie, but genuine brotherhood among men who had been tested and proven themselves worthy of each other's respect. As the evening wore on, Marcus and Sterling found themselves in increasingly personal conversation. Sterling talked about his plans after his current service obligation ended, admitting that he was considering civilian opportunities but questioning whether he could find the same sense of purpose outside the military. Marcus shared his own uncertainty about his future, describing the difficulty of explaining his military experience to potential civilian employers who had no frame of reference for what he had done or learned. "Sometimes I think the hardest part isn't what we experienced over there," Sterling observed. "It's coming back and realizing that most people can't understand what we've been through. They mean well, but they have no context for it." Marcus nodded emphatically. "Exactly. They see the uniform or hear about the deployments, and they think they understand, but they're imagining something completely different from what actually happened." Their conversation was interrupted by last call, and the group began to disperse with handshakes, contact information exchanges, and promises to stay in touch. As the pub emptied, Marcus and Sterling found themselves alone again, but the intimacy of their earlier conversation had been enriched by the broader fellowship they had experienced throughout the evening. Walking through the quiet London streets toward Sterling's flat, both men reflected on the unexpected turn their day had taken. What had begun as a formal diplomatic ceremony had evolved into something much more personal and meaningful. They had discovered not just their shared military experience, but a genuine friendship based on mutual respect and understanding. Sterling's flat was modest but comfortable, decorated with photographs from his various deployments and a few pieces of military equipment that clearly held sentimental value. As they settled in for a final conversation over coffee, Marcus felt a sense of completion that had been missing from his life since returning from his last deployment. "I want you to know," Sterling said as the evening wound down, "that today has meant more to me than just about any official ceremony I've participated in. Finding someone who truly understands what we've been through, what we carry with us, that's rare and valuable." Marcus felt the same way. In Sterling, he had found something he hadn't realized he was looking for. Validation that his experiences mattered, that the weight he carried was shared by others, and that the bonds forged in service could transcend any boundary. They exchanged contact information and made tentative plans for Sterling to visit the United States when his leave schedule permitted. More importantly, they established a commitment to maintaining their connection regardless of the geographical distance between them. As Marcus prepared to leave for his hotel, both men stood at Sterling's door with the reluctance that comes from ending something meaningful. Their handshake was firm and prolonged, carrying with it the acknowledgement of everything they had shared and the promise of continued friendship. "Until next time, brother," Sterling said simply. "Until next time," Marcus replied, and both men knew that the connection they had forged would endure whatever challenges lay ahead. Walking back through the quiet London streets, Marcus reflected on the unexpected gift he had received. He had come to London to represent his country at a formal ceremony, but he was leaving with something far more valuable: the knowledge that he was part of a brotherhood that transcended nationality, that his experiences were shared and understood by others, and that the bonds of military service could create lasting friendships in the most unlikely circumstances. The tension that had marked their first meeting had transformed into something neither man had expected: a genuine friendship built on shared experience, mutual respect, and the recognition that some bonds are forged in circumstances that civilian life simply cannot replicate. Their story would continue across oceans and time zones, proving that the brotherhood of arms knows no boundaries when men of honor recognize each other as equals.